So today's webinar, we are going to aim to do several things. We are going to start by identifying the differences between adult and teenage learners, looking particularly at teenagers' cognitive ability, their personal development, hobbies and interests and world knowledge. Then we'll consider what makes tasks appropriate for teenagers. Then we'll highlight the main differences between the different versions of Cambridge English exam tasks, the adult version and the for school version. And finally, we'll look at how the same principles for choosing tasks that are suitable for teenagers in the for schools exams can be applied to selecting appropriate tasks to use in the classroom. And then there will be an opportunity for you to share ideas via the chat box. Several opportunities. You will be able to access the webinar on your YouTube channel after the webinar, so you can read the comments again. I'll give you the link to that at the end of the webinar. Now I'll hand back over to Corinne, who will talk about the characteristics of our for schools candidates.
Thanks, Sylvia. So let's start with a question for you. How old do you think the majority of students taking the Cambridge English Key for Schools exams are? Using the polling button, remember this is at A2 level in the Common European Framework of References for Language. So using the polling button, choose A for 10 to 12-year-olds, B for 11 to 13, or C for 12 to 14-year-olds. So I can see some people are writing in the chat box, but if you could try using your polling button at the top of above the chat box. See a lot of A's and B's, some C's. Okay, the majority of people have selected B, but actually the correct answer is C, 12 to 14-year-olds. In fact, 70% of candidates taking this exam in 2013 were aged between 12 and 14 years old. So here in this slide is more information on ages in the Cambridge English Young Learners and for Schools exams between 2011 and 2013. You can see here that the Cambridge English Preliminary for Schools is taken mainly by students between the ages of 13 and 15. And Cambridge English First for Schools by students from 16 to 18 years old. Obviously, the ages at which learners take these tests vary in different parts of the world and with different learning situations. But how does this match your experience? Are your learners, your for schools learners, around this age, or are they older, younger? Again, use your polling buttons to choose A for a similar age, B for older, or C for younger. So I can see some people are writing in the chat box. If you can try using your polling button, but I see a lot of B's, some A's. For keys or for preliminary, either exam, the ones you're most familiar with. So it looks like most people have picked A, so a very similar age. And now let's think about the differences between adults and teenage learners. What are the differences between these two sets of learners? Again, write some ideas or comments in the chat box now. If you've not taught adult learners, think about your own experiences of learning as an adult and when you were younger. So what are some of the differences? So attention span, I see level of difficulty, maturity, motivation, some very interesting and good points you've made. Here are some of the aspects that need to be considered when comparing teenagers and adults' learning experiences. You need to consider their cognitive and personal development, their knowledge about the world, their language skills, and the topics that interest them. So now Sylvia is going to talk about these differences in more detail.
Thank you, Corinne. First, let's look at the cognitive development of teenagers, which is a huge factor in learning a language. Compared to adults, teenagers have more challenges in regulating their own learning behavior and their own emotions. Therefore, we will start by talking about how to help learners improve in this area. Researchers point out that young learners can actually be trained with appropriate teaching and support to become more self-regulated and to take more control of the learning experience themselves. Self-regulation in education involves a range of skills such as the ability to organize, plan, monitor and evaluate your own learning, and it also involves cognitive skills such as attention, control, memory strategies, problem solving, also metacognitive skills such as understanding one's own learning and thinking processes, and affective skills such as monitoring and regulating one's moods, feelings and emotions. All of these elements will have an impact on learning and attainment. You can help young learners in this process of self-regulation by establishing routines that aim to gradually reduce learner reliance and dependence on direction and reminders. So does this match your experience? Do your learners need help with self-regulation? And if yes, how do you help them with this? Can you write some ideas in the chat box now? So yes, you are saying that it does match your experience. Teenagers don't have to have bad experience regarding language learning.
Yes, the idea of writing objectives on the board is a good idea.
Agreed rules, very good idea. Guidance, they need guidance and advice. They need orientation, rules. Very, very good ideas. Very similar to what? Thank you very much. Lots and lots of thoughts coming through there. Now that you have come up with some interesting ideas, let's talk some more about learner self-regulation and how it can be achieved in the classroom. Here are some ideas about how you can increase learner autonomy and independence. First, gradually reduce the level of support and prompting. And you can do that by establishing routines and providing cues as a reminder of what the students need to do themselves. It may also help to break tasks into manageable chunks and allow learners to work through activities at their own pace. Encouraging more spontaneous and reliable performance could be achieved by introducing more pair work or group work activities. Also self-evaluation processes to improve realistic self-assessment without damaging teenagers' self-esteem. If you try these approaches, eventually students should be able to rely less and less on direction and reminders and will become more autonomous and independent in their learning. Now Corinne will talk about some other differences between teenagers and adults.
Thanks, Sylvia. So in addition to the differences Sylvia just mentioned, another important aspect to consider is the personal and social development of teenagers. What elements of teenage personal development do you think may have an impact on their learning and affect you as a teacher? Write some ideas in the chat box now. So their emotions, societal expectation, confidence, yes, peer pressure, that's a big one. Their family, friendships. So you've come up with some very good ideas. At this age, in their development, there's often a strong peer influence when it comes to likes and dislikes, preferences and sympathies, and preoccupations, as you've mentioned. So, for example, in the choices young learners or teenagers make related to clothes, music, linguistic behavior, their physical appearance, and leisure activities. Teenagers place huge importance on friendships, relations with others, and social networks, as this is when young people are building their identity. They're often very concerned about their popularity, and there's a great deal of group conformity in their behavior, which you can sometimes see in the language classroom when learners do not want to stand out from their friends. In contrast, at this point they are also developing their social skills and growing in confidence. They have the ability to take part in social interaction, but they are still willing to be playful, innovative, and creative. They're usually less conventional than adults, and have a more critical stance towards adult aspirations and values, which are positive aspects that you should consider when thinking about activities to use with teens. Individual differences also start to play an increasingly important role, and this may have an effect on such aspects as personality, cognitive style, motivation, emotional state, and group affiliations, which can impact on their language learning. Are any of these aspects of teen, personal, social development issues for language learning problematic for you in your context? If so, which ones, and how do you deal with them? Write your answers in the chat box now. So I can see I don't see people, in terms of what aspects of their social and personal life are problematic, that you find problematic in your context, your teaching and learning context. See, the last person talked about peer pressure. Okay. If you want to read more about this in more detail, Penny Eckert has done a lot of research on this subject in the United States. Sylvia?
Thank you. Let's go on. Another aspect that is developing very quickly in the teenage years and needs to be considered when teaching teenagers is that at this age they are still learning about the world. It's widely known that the teenage years can be the best and worst time in life. Teenagers will have widely different experiences depending on their upbringing, the education they participate in, and the relationships with those around them. Both language and cognitive development are shaped by local influences such as cultural and educational factors. Some of these factors, which may affect language learning and teaching, include teenagers' educational experience and their familiarity with testing and exams. This could be very varied depending on the local situation in different parts of the world. Also, relationships with authority figures may also be very varied depending on the education system. Teenagers need to learn the kind of academic language of the school and classroom compared to the more familiar kind of language experience at home and out of school. Learners of this age will also be developing their knowledge of the world and adult topics. In contrast to adults, teenagers are also more likely to have limited experience of visiting or spending time in the country where the language they are learning is spoken, and they have fewer opportunities to interact with people from the target culture. So their exposure to the language may be totally limited to what goes on in the classroom. Therefore, the bulk of language learning takes place in the classroom. This means that a full range of language and interactional patterns need to be exemplified as much as possible within the classroom by the teacher, which can be challenging. Language learning is most successful when language is used for communicative purposes, but this may be difficult in the highly controlled classroom environment. For example, it may be difficult to encourage the students to speak to each other in English during pair or group work, which often feels to them false. Therefore, the type of activities chosen by the teacher is absolutely crucial. The other issue is that language used in the school, which may or may not be the same language learners use at home, is shared, so you as a teacher will be able to use it to explain vocabulary or grammar if you want. The use of the first language can facilitate learning when used appropriately because it can save precious classroom time for communicative activities. But learners can easily fall into a trap of relying far too much on the first language in the English classroom, thus reducing the time they get to practice the L2, the second language. So it's a fine balance you need to strike. Another issue that language teachers may face is that teenagers' first language skills are still developing at this point. Research shows that first language development is positively related to second language development. So students who have strong literacy skills in their first language tend to be better able to transfer these skills to help them learn their second language more effectively. As the first language development happens at very different stages, there may be big differences in the second language ability in the same classroom. In this case, teachers need to be able to develop differentiated activities for students at different language levels, which is very challenging. So now that we have talked about the challenges, I'll hand back things to Corinne, who will discuss some possible solutions with you.
Thanks, Sylvia. So how can we help overcome some of these challenges? It can be difficult to increase learners' exposure to English if they're not in an English-speaking environment. What kind of things do you do to help your learners gain more experience of English? Type in the chat box any ideas you have for giving learners more exposure to English. It could be things like listening or watching news items. I see someone's put listening, songs, films or TV, role plays, internet chat forums. Some great ideas here. You could also get them, for example, to read different news items and to report on them. Maybe they could integrate information from 2 different English medium newspapers and then show them to their classmates. Or maybe they could make a poster, a physical or even electronic online one. Let's look at some of your other ideas that you have to increase how much English is in the classroom. We have the BBC podcasts, holidays abroad, I suppose, if you can afford it. Performances, social networks, some great ideas. Thank you. Here are some more ideas that we thought of as well, such as reading a class text. This is a really good way to help learners feel confident about reading in English. Or what about finding pen friends? If you'd like to find pen friends, then you could sign up to Cambridge English Pen Friends. We have lots of schools who have signed up all over the world, and it's designed for schools, so it's safe and secure for you and your students. If you'd like to find out more, then look on our website for this. As you mentioned, songs, video clips, or films are great ideas. There's also a lot of resources on the internet, as you've mentioned, that both you as the teacher can use and your learners themselves can use to increase their exposure to English outside the classroom. Remember to look for ways to get learners reading extensively in English as well. This is a really good way to develop reading skills and to broaden vocabulary and world knowledge. Another point to consider, though, is the topics that you choose. So Sylvia will talk about this now.
Yes, as anyone who has taught teenagers or who has got teenagers themselves will know, they have very different interests from adults, which can relate to many of the points we have already discussed so far. What topics do you find work well with teenagers who you teach? Can you? I know you are still answering the last.
Oh, they're talking sports, music.
Oh yeah, so this is about topics already. Thank you. Celebrities, sports, games, friendship,
Technology.
fashion. Very good. Celebrities again. Thank you. Okay, there is a lot of ideas.
Relationships.
Yeah, history, yes. Technology, going out, socializing, loads and loads of ideas. Yeah, okay, thank you for all those ideas. Zombies. Okay. Thank you. Mobile phones even, games, yes. Karaoke. Nature, science. Okay.
And now write some.
And now, so let's talk about topics which you find do not work well with teenagers. So what are the topics that you would tend to avoid? Any topics that you would not want to discuss with teenagers? Yes, I can see answers. Taboo topics, politics, medicine even. Any others?
History.
We need to scroll here on our screen. Religion, health even. Yeah, sex. There was, a couple of people.
Environment. Waiting. Yes.
Weight, eating disorders.
Very interesting.
Very, very, very philosophy even, parents. Thank you very much for all your lovely ideas. These are the ideas we tend to avoid. So let's see what topics work well in our exams, which are actually covered in Cambridge English for Schools exams and the course book material we have. The topics of appearance and health are actually very popular, including, for example, clothes, hairstyles, discussion of or advice about health issues such as diet or sunbathing. These work well, we find. Friends, relationships and parties obviously work very well. Activities and hobbies are topics that are very popular among teenagers, including, for example, pop culture and music, as we said, computer games, cinema and television programs, soap operas, cartoons. For music, television and films, topics can include a wide range, for example, actors' performances and looks, film music, special effects in films, narrating and comparing films, discussing ideas behind films, or even quoting lines from films. The next topic area is school and related activities such as teachers or schoolwork, plus school activities like theatre groups, sports or choir also work well. Although you need to tread carefully with some topics, as we said, teenagers will be having peer and family conversations about such topics as you mentioned, such as justice and care, cruelty, relationships already among 10 to 12-year-olds, or politics, history, war and religion, or travelling among older teenagers up to 16-year-olds. Please note, as you have also mentioned, that these are taboo topics and they are potentially upsetting topics which would never appear in Cambridge English exam papers such as politics, religion or war. So bearing in mind all these aspects of how learning as a teenager differs from learning as an adult, what actually works when it comes to teaching and learning in the classroom? Not just teaching, but also testing teenagers. Let's take a look at some tasks from the For Schools exams. For this, you'll need the handout, which Pippa was talking about at the beginning of the webinar. So if you could go and access that. You have saved that file.
Great. So let's look first at the speaking task on the handout for Cambridge English Preliminary for Schools. In this task, the learners need to talk about the different rooms to describe them and contrast them. So in what way is this task good for learners? Can you focus on different things? You can focus on different things. Is it interesting for teenagers? Is it relevant? Is it based on cultural knowledge? What do you think? Type some answers in the chat box now. So some people mentioned it's everyday life. It's similar to their own space. They spend a lot of time in their rooms already. It's very familiar. Exactly. It's great to see all your answers, and you have lots of good ideas here. As a lot of people said, the topic is relevant and should be interesting for teenagers. A bedroom should be a familiar topic for everyone. It's something even young learners would have experience and knowledge of. The tasks also should be very accessible to young teenagers. Now let's look at the Cambridge English Key for Schools task, the reading and writing task. In this task, learners need to read the notices and match them to what they mean. Like before, think about how this task is good for younger candidates. Think about the topic and the task. Is it relevant, interesting for teenagers? Write your ideas in the chat box now. So it's comprehension of every day, it's their world. Schools, institutions, it's relevant, it's easy, it's everyday language. Yes, that's right, a lot of good ideas. This task is going to be good because it relates to learners' world experience, as some of you mentioned. The context and the situation should all be quite familiar to teenagers or young learners. So far, we've looked at tasks from our For Schools exams, but a lot of teachers and candidates ask about the difference between the For Schools exams and the other exams at the same level. So let's look at the handout to see two example writing papers. Take a look at the tasks, example A and example B, and decide which one is more appropriate for teenagers and which one is for adult learners. Write some reasons for your choice in the chat box now. So it's the example A and example B in the handout. Which one is for young learners and which one do you think is for teenagers and why? Okay, so you can write your answers in the chat box. I think we've got a little bit of frozen. Okay, so some people are saying B is for young learners. Book review is more general towards teenagers. Someone's saying articles are geared to adults. Yeah, yes, the example A is the Cambridge English First adult version of the paper, and example B is the Cambridge English First for Schools writing paper, as many of you noticed. When comparing the two versions, you can see that the instructions, word length, type of questions, and the format are almost identical, except that the For Schools version includes an extra question in part 2, as teenagers can answer a question on a set text. For the 2015 version of the paper, this option has been removed from the adult version, but retained on the For Schools version, so that teachers can integrate the reading of a set text into their lessons if they wish. The other difference is that the For Schools version includes a story task type, as this is appealing to some teenagers, and the adult version includes a report instead, as this is a task type not usually familiar to children at school, but would be for adults. The topics on the paper are chosen to be appealing to teenagers, and the topic of the Part 1 essay question will be based around a subject that teenagers can reasonably be expected to have an opinion on. So in this case, education, and whether home education is good or a bad idea from the learner's point of view. In Part 2, there's always a clear context appropriate to teenagers, topic, purpose, and target reader. And as you can see here, there is a personal letter about special places, a review on teenage fashion, a story aimed at young readers, and an essay on the set book. All of these questions should be accessible to the age group taking the test. Sylvia?
Thank you. So finally, let's take a look at some ideas for classroom activities for teenage learners. What activities have you used or do you use in your English classes with teenagers that have worked well? Write your ideas in the chat box now. So what activities have you used?
Role plays?
Lyrics, song lyrics, portfolios, project work. Oh, lots. we can hardly read them. So many competitions, yes. Role plays. Thank you. Suddenly, oh yeah, more and more. Sometimes our screen freezes. Thank you very much. Presentations, dramatizations.
Lots of good ideas.
Very, very many good ideas. So many we can't even read. Okay. Rap songs, yes. So as many of you suggested, activities which engage the learners in speaking, such as debates or role plays, usually work well. One kind of debate you could try is a hot air balloon debate, where class members represent famous people they all know, and they try to persuade the class why they should not be thrown out of the hot air balloon. This usually generates a lot of discussion. Ranking activities, where the class evaluate different opinions on subjects they are familiar with, such as what makes a good parent or what makes a good teacher, are also often very successful. Problem-solving activities are also great in engaging young people, especially ones involving dilemmas which they themselves may have to deal with, or other more imaginary topics like surviving on another planet. Simulation games also often work well, and young learners are familiar with creating imaginary alternative realities, as they do sometimes in many computer games. Any activity which involves questioning rules, procedures, or adult authority usually goes down well. For example, putting learners in charge of the school is one idea you could use to engage the class in discussion, planning, and writing activities. Starting a topic with a speaking activity is a very good way to involve the students from the beginning and help them to develop ideas, challenge each other's ideas, and discuss and debate alternatives. This can then evolve into focusing on other skills such as their listening skills or reading or writing, or develop a particular grammar or vocabulary area.
Okay, so some great ideas and practical ideas. So now let's look again at one of the activities from the Cambridge English Preliminary for Schools speaking test, which we looked at earlier, to think of some other activities. So for you, could you create your own activities? How could you create your own activities from the picture in the handbook for your learners? Maybe you could ask them to decide on the rules they have about their rooms and the rules they would like to create. Could be a kind of debate. Or maybe they could talk about an alternative room, maybe their ideal room or a room they would like to create to relax in. Or they could have a choice of pictures and then decide as a group the room they would like best, a kind of ranking activity. These are all useful activities which can help them develop their speaking skills. Now let's look at the Cambridge English Key for Schools example from Reading and Writing Part 1. There are lots of different ideas you can use here. Maybe learners could decide which rules to have in the classroom or in different places or times at school. Again, a collaborative task, a ranking task. They could make rules for the dining room, for example. Another idea could be to make rules for groups. This would be for something you are working on, a topic, for example. If your topic is animals or festivals, learners could make rules for those animals or the festivals. A rule for bears, for example, could be every day you must have meat and berries in your lunchbox. You could do this with even very young learners and very young children, and they could work on the rules and put them up around the room. Or you could do something to get them moving around. One idea is to give your learners matching rules and sentences. For example, the sentence could be, you should put things back in the right place. So the rule could be, please return all books to the correct shelf. Then the students must stand up and find the person who has a rule or sentence which has the same meaning as their own. This is a good way to vary the kinds of activities which your learners do, especially if you want them to practice exam tasks in a fun way. One more idea is to practice making rules and thinking about the meaning and context, which is a very important activity. So maybe you could ask learners to think about all the places they have rules, at home, at school, or maybe at sports clubs, for example. Each group has to look for real examples of rules for each place. This is good for learners who are in an English-speaking country, but you could still do it by asking them to find examples in their own language. Then you could make ones in English which are similar and ask the learners to match them. There are lots of different ideas of how to make tasks which relate to the learner's own experience of the world and their stage of cognitive development.
Thank you. So, to summarize, in this webinar we have looked at some of the differences between adult and teenage learners and considered what makes tasks appropriate for them. We've looked at some of the tasks from the For Schools exams and shared some ideas on classroom ideas for teenage learners who are preparing for the exams.
So a lot of great questions that you've asked, and Sylvia and I will try to respond to some of them in the next 5-10 minutes. So one comment that came up several times is about the whether the certificates are valid for life. And yes, they are, whether they're for schools or the adult versions. Those certificates are valid for life. Institutions or organizations may have limits on when you have taken the exam. For example, they may not accept a certificate that's more than 2 years old, but we consider the certificates valid for life. Sylvia, do you want to comment?
Right. The next one was a question about the use of L1. Somebody was saying that it's a big issue, and yes, it is. It is a very controversial topic. How much you need to use the L1? But I think the best is to try and strike a balance between the amount that you have to use for especially the weaker students, if the L1 is a shared language, obviously, in the classroom, because that will speed up things to explain a particularly difficult grammar point, for example, or even explain a vocabulary item, what it means in the student's first language. But at the same time, as we said in the seminar, in the webinar, that it will limit the time, that the precious time that the students have in the classroom to interact with each other. So you as teachers will have to decide on the amount you devote to the use of L1, and you allow students to use the L1. It's a very controversial topic, especially within classrooms where subject matter is taught, CLIL classrooms, for example. However, nowadays, times are changing because, for example, some people consider the use of L1 translanguaging a positive aspect. Code switching, a positive aspect of classrooms. You need to consider your own context and the needs of your own students, to what extent you allow yourself and the students to use the first language in the classroom.
And I think also, as long as it's clear, I think both the teacher and the students need to be clear when they're using the L1 and why, and I think that sometimes helps.
Yes.
Another question someone asked was about the limited opportunities of using the L2 in their context. And again, this is a common problem when you're not working in an English-speaking environment. But as many people said in the webinar, the internet can be a great source of native English speakers, as well as online chat rooms, obviously controlled like Pen Friends, to make sure it's safe and secure for your learners. But there's a lot of opportunities for learners to either listen and read authentic English material online. Also, I think because younger teenagers and learners are so engaged with technology, they may be more willing to do this outside the classroom. So you're not having to necessarily do it in the classroom, which I think is important. And that, again, supports the ideas that Sylvia was talking about, is getting them to self-regulate and to manage their own learning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a very interesting question I can see, the last one about SEN, Special Educational Needs Students, and materials for teenagers. Of course, all our provisions for special educational needs learners are exactly the same as for adult versions. So we have special requirements for blind candidates, braille papers, for example. We have special listening DVDs made up for candidates who need more time and pauses in the listening CD or DVD listening material. So obviously we have the same provisions for special educational needs students. Dyslexia, for example, is quite a prominent feature of special requirements within the Young Learners tests, and I presume the for schools exams as well. And yes, we do allow those candidates to have extra time to finish the exam, so they have the same provisions as adult learners who have special educational needs.
Excellent. So some other questions. One person asked about how do you get teachers involved or interested in topics that you've prepared that they're not so interested in?
Teenagers.
Teenagers, yes. Yes, teenagers can be very fickle. But I think one of the important things is asking learners and finding out before perhaps you prepare things, is finding out what actually does interest them. Doing a quick poll or a survey, and you can even do that using technology if many of them have cell phones, asking them the type of topics that they're interested in. And maybe having students prepare some of the materials on the topics to share with their classmates can also help with engaging them in the learning process and making them slightly more autonomous learners. But I think it's always a problem of finding topics that teenagers would like, but I think it's important to engage them in that process and ask them what they are interested in.
Yes, because they will. If they
They will
choose the
tell you.
topic, they will tell you what they want to talk about in the classroom. There's a question about, can I just read it out? If a student who took the Cambridge Placement Test was not able to finish the exam, will he or she be able to know this and their proficiency level? So the Cambridge Placement Test is an adaptive test, so there is no time limit on it. I think the question is about not being able to finish the exam, but at the end of the placement test, the result should tell the student what proficiency level they are. The time they take in the placement test will vary depending on how quickly the program, the test, the algorithm can decide the level of the student. So I'm not sure I understand that question. Basically, they shouldn't have timed out. They should be able to get their proficiency level at the end. There is no time limit to the placement test. That was just an interesting question, which is not particularly relevant for teenagers. But there's another couple of questions about the FCE, whether 18, 19-year-olds would need to take the first for schools
Or the standard first.
or the first
I think it depends on your learners, and again, the
context.
of the learning situation. In that case, an 18 or 19-year-old, it would be appropriate for them to take either exam. And it may be just more an issue of dates. We don't have a very hard or fast rule about that.
But of
it's
course, the
topics.
certificate is the same. So
Yeah.
what they get at the end
Is the same, and it may be just the level of maturity of those 18 or 19-year-olds, if they
and their interests.
and their world experience. So I think that's all we have time for. So thank you very much for attending today. We look forward to seeing you at our future webinars. The next one will be on Cambridge English First Writing. What's new and how can you help your learners? So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.